From the jaw-dropping 3-second knockout against Ben Askren to his 6-day notice title shot against Kamaru Usman, let's take a look at some of the craziest moments from game-bred Masvidal's illustrious UFC career. Over the years, Masvidal has become the undisputed king of split decisions. Before Jorge shifted his game plan around 2019, he was on a roller coaster UFC career that only seemed to go down. Gamebred had always been an insanely talented fighter. He was Kimbo Slice's prodigy and an internet street fighting sensation before he ever stepped foot inside the octagon, and fans kept waiting for Jorge to go on a magical run to the championship. But it just never happened. And I think it was because Gamebred kept finding himself on the wrong side of extremely close fights. It got more and more shocking each time it happened. In the first 10 years that Jorge spent in the UFC, he lost a split decision 5 times. Each time it happened, Jorge would be putting together a couple of victories in a row before getting a jump in competitions against names like Raging Al, former champion Benson Henderson, and former 2-time #1 contender Damian Maia, and then restart his run from scratch. It became more and more infuriating every time it would happen, and it happened a lot. Jorge never seemed to learn the lessons from his mistakes, and we could barely believe our eyes when Masvidal lost 2 split decisions in a row in 2015-2016. His inability to get any constant momentum going in his career was what gave Gamebred his second nickname of Journeyman. Had Gamebred never destroyed Askren to change the trajectory of his career, we wouldn't have half the moments on this list. Speaking of Ben, we have to talk about the 3-second knockout. I'd say this was the fight that changed Jorge's career, but you can hardly call the singular strike landed in the bout a fight. It was more like an execution. It's safe to say nobody liked funky Ben Askren when he was traded to the UFC in exchange for Mighty Mouse, but everybody was curious to see how the undefeated, undisputed welterweight champion from Bellator and ONE FC would fare in the UFC. Okay, maybe they had other reasons too. Everybody wanted to see Ben having the living daylights beat out of him because of his often irritating personality and his over-the-top promotion tactics. Fans were rooting for Jorge, but Askren's submission victory over Robbie Lawler and his resume itself had fans worried for Gamebred. The two fighters were engaged in a pretty heated war of words leading up to the fight. They clearly didn't like each other, and Jorge proved he couldn't wait to get his hands or knees on Askren as soon as the bell rang. The street fighter turned an angle and sprinted toward Askren, who instinctively went for a takedown, but he was met in the face with a jumping knee that had Ben stretched out and stiff as a board a few seconds into the fight. I'd definitely call this the most surprising of Jorge's finishes, but my pick for Jorge's most bizarre moment has to go to his ambush of Leon Edwards. Rocky may not have expected it, but he was force-fed a 3-piece combo and a soda by Gamebred. Masvidal didn't just turn on his killer mentality for the octagon, he wanted all the smoke with everybody, even backstage. When Masvidal felt Leon Edwards, a rival contender in his own division, disrespected him while the former street fighter gave an interview, he decided to walk up to him and ask him what the problem was. It all looked innocent enough. Fighters do this stuff to sell fights all the time, and Jorge's hands were behind his back. In a flash, his fist went up as soon as Rocky was in range and landed 3 quick jabs to his face before ducking away, leaving Leon confused, enraged, and bloody. It's a shame the two never ended up fighting each other. Edwards faced a number of fight cancellations in COVID that put his career on pause, while Masvidal went his separate way with Ben Askren. But this backstage brawl wasn't the only reason Masvidal made the headlines headlines that week. Darren Till was the first jaw-dropper in Gamebred's title run, and it was also the biggest upset of Jorge's career. The Gorilla was by far the hottest prospect in the UFC at the time, with his international fan base, nasty highlight reel, and larger-than-life personality, which made him the perfect target for Jorge's plan on becoming a straight-up killer. We may have been shocked Jorge wasn't stringing victories together, but it didn't even come close to Masvidal's own disappointment in himself, and he vowed to never settle for a decision victory again. The fight seemed to go as the matchmakers expected at the start. Till caught Jorge early on with a left and knocked him down, establishing his power advantage. But Gamebred's new aggression began working once he got back to his feet and established some respect in the striking. It seemed like it was going to be a back-and-forth war until Gamebred landed a jumping hook to become the first UFC fighter to knock the Gorilla out cold. And the fact that the fight was in London, Till's backyard, alongside him being the betting favorite, made this knockout one of those shocking upsets that make MMA the most exciting sport in the world. Another thing the UFC has going for them is their willingness to make crazy matchups for the fans. The entire BMF belt fiasco is one of Jorge's highlights. Not only was the baddest a unique, one-time thing the UFC created to bump their numbers, it was an extremely competitive fight. Nate Diaz is one of the biggest stars in mixed martial arts today, but back in 2019, he was still getting finishes over top fighters, and called Jorge out right after his demolition of Askren with the BMF belt on the line. I have to mention The Rock giving away this belt here though, because even that was a bizarre experiment Dana White did for just this fight, but the fight itself had some pretty awesome moments. For one, nobody expected Jorge to come out that fast and that strong against Nate, even if the Stockton Slugger is a notoriously slow starter. Within 2 rounds, Diaz's face looked like it went through a wood chipper, forcing the doctor to stop the fight because of a huge cut above Nate's eye. All of a sudden, the fans had their favorite UFC journeyman in a position for a title shot. He'd succeeded in putting together victories impressive enough over big enough names to make him impossible to deny. Even Jorge's first title shot was sudden. Masvidal was lucky that the UFC was the only sport in the world that not only maintained its schedule in COVID-19 lockdown, it actually grew its audience, because he didn't lose the momentum he'd built with his historic 3-fight streak and BMF title victory. He still wasn't next in line for the shot. Champion Kamaru Usman was set to headline UFC 251 against Gilbert Burns, but Durinho caught the coronavirus less than a week before the event. The card was considered to be doomed, but then came Gamebred from halfway around the world, flying to Abu Dhabi and cutting nearly 30 pounds of weight in almost 6 days to save the card and seize the opportunity that presented itself. I wasn't the only one who thought it was impossible, and simply seeing Masvidal step onto the scales at 170 pounds was a victory in my books, even if he got dominated by the champion for 5 rounds and then knocked out in the rematch. Well folks, those are the most shocking, bizarre moments from Masvidal's UFC career.